Hi everyone, welcome to lecture. This is a continuation of part 1 where we are talking about the fields in which exercise and nutrition sciences are experienced, studied, and practiced. We are moving on to 1.3 talking about sports, and we're going to talk about most of the terms and concepts that we might already be familiar with that are related to working with and studying the field of sport. Sport, by definition, are activities involving physical exertion and skill in which an individual or team competes for entertainment. That's a pretty broad definition that we could take in a million angles, but I'm going to hone in and look at the physical exertion and skill components of sports. Actually, I'm not going to do that first. First, I'm going to define and classify types of sports, but then go into the physical exertion and skill components. In other words, the things that we learn in practice and in training. There are many ways to classify or group sports, and it typically breaks down to what we're interested in studying or what we're experiencing while we're doing the sport. So for instance, if you're in the world of athletic training and you particularly like to work in the field of concussion research, then you would be interested in the contact and no contact elements of sports. And if you were more on the exercise physiology, metabolic, or you worked in research and development for coming up with performance enhancing compounds, you might be interested in the stamina versus power aspects of the sport, or what energy systems would be benefiting from a product you're developing. Again, the experience is a big part of it. For instance, are these things that are done in the summer versus the winter? Are they things that are done with a team or not with a team, or side by side or face to face? Those aspects bring different elements to the game and to the sport in the ways that which we experience them. So sports performances require a varying proportion of strength, stamina, and recovery, or what we call physical condition, and skill. Now, this is just a schematic, so it's just giving you kind of a representation so that you understand how these different types of factors relate to performance. But look at the difference between a power lifter and an arm wrestler. An arm wrestler and a power lifter have to have about the same amount of strength to really excel and compete well in their sport. However, because the arm wrestler has to endure the strength press a little longer, they have to do a little bit more muscle stamina training. Over here on the other side of that spectrum, you take someone that does like archery or kind of a shoot sport or a golfing sport that doesn't require a lot of aerobic or anaerobic activity. They're going to require much more skills training and less down here on the conditioning side. And then, of course, distance runner, that makes perfect sense, especially in contrast to the power lifter. They need tons of stamina to be able to go forever and ever, and they don't need as much strength. And skill, about the same, except power lifter a little larger because they have more at risk if their technique isn't right. It would take a lot of running wrong for a distance runner to have their skill really impact their injury risk. However, actually, if you're a distance runner, you're probably like, you're stupid, lady. Really, though, it's the truth that technique makes a huge difference if you're an elite level distance runner. But in general, you're getting the gist. Oopsie. Basketball players, soccer players, sports that require like intermittent endurance and stamina activity and power, like kicking and shooting and jumping and things that come in sports are called combo sports. And again, if we went back here, these are those ones in the middle that require, combination power and stamina training. So a lot of these things, our physical condition and skills, are based on nature and nurture. They're influenced based on nature and nurture. And of course, nurture being the environment that you're in, the coaching and the instruction that you have, the amount of motivation that you're able to pick up along the way, and nature being those things that you're innately born with. And for example, on the nature side of things, everyone's born with a muscle fiber composition that is different based on their genetics. I don't know what else to say there. They're born with a certain proportion of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers, which we'll talk about more in a minute. But those different types of fibers and the way that they make up the muscle in general has an influence on the way that people perform. For instance, if you have a high proportion of the fast twitch or glycolytic muscle fibers, you're probably going to be a better sprinter. And those are the ones that appear here more in white. And then if you're really high proportion, if you have a really high ratio of the red kind and the kind that are rich in myoglobin, then you're more likely to do good at endurance sports. And so a lot of these things are genetically based, and that's probably no surprise for us. And again, it's exposure to the nature part of this, their inheritance, their genetics, and also to the environmental aspects and the exposure. And again, the motive, the opportunities, there's a lot that goes into it. But again, in exercise nutrition sciences, we're kind of focusing more on these nature and biological aspects more than opportunities in sports and things of that nature. Just like always, when we are talking about the field of sports, where we get in, where we fit in is in the area of physical activity and nutrition, but more so physical activity with the kinesiology major. And physical activity is defined as voluntary skeletal muscle, substantially increasing energy expenditure, and it is goal oriented. Obviously, I've said that 95 times. That's on the test. In the world of physical activities, we're covering in the lecture of the sports field. We're covering the specific types of exercise as training, and we're also covering the specific skilled movement for sport performance. First, we're going to talk about movement skills. And movement skills we defined also way back in the beginning, but it involves accuracy, direction, rhythm, and force to create sport movements. And sport movements might be anything from jumping, dribbling, swinging, which are required in a number of sports. And obviously, sports require many different types of sports movements. To execute those sports movements well, we have to be able to have movement skills. And right here's a little table that's showing what those specific movement skills mean in the sports world. But those are things that we learn in education settings and by sport instructors and coaches. They are learned by practice, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more. So remember that the purple means that these are fields and occupations within the field of sport. Sport instruction, coaches, and teaching. These are the areas, if you like the concept of movement skills and you would like to teach people who are learning and how to enhance their skills, including their agility, balance, coordination, stability, and flexibility, so that they can perform these sport movements over here, then we're talking in your realm. You will have coursework in the area of sport movement skills, and especially in the area of motor learning, biomechanics, and even if you wanted to go on and take child development, you could also learn more about it there. I have here a picture of the snatch only because it's an example of one that I just said in powerlifting that this was something, if you're a powerlifter, you're probably someone who needs more strength and skill, but it's, again, everything, nothing's exclusive. These things aren't living in silos. All of these terms and concepts and definitions, they are very inclusive and overlapping in a lot of ways. If you're a powerlifter, you're thinking, oh my gosh, it takes so much technique and skill, like absolutely. So yes, all sorts of sports movement takes skills. Some just take a little bit less skills training than others. A golf swing takes an inordinate amount more skills training. There's just so many more points in the plane of the swing and so many more things that happen in the body's rotation that it makes just a much more complicated thing to teach than the move of snatch, which, by the way, again, is high risk. So it isn't necessarily saying it's not important again. So when we talk about practice, it's defined probably a million ways if you looked it up, but I'm calling it a task-specific activity that enhances our neuromuscular precision and skill. And that concept you're going to learn a lot more about in your motor learning class, but it's basically looking at the concept of if you practice, you become more precise because your neuron improves. You have more neurotransmitter release at this synaptic membrane here, and the practice creates a more concentrated synaptic membrane and a better action potential. Also, the cortex, or the drive to perform that activity, it gets stronger, and this whole concept is neuroplasticity. So practice is specifically designed to enhance neuroplasticity, to improve precision and skill. Learning, there's a lot of different theories about learning, but I think the most prominent one is the one about the 3 stages of practice. How it's first a verbal cognitive stage where you're telling yourself and you're having errors, and then it becomes a little bit more autonomic to all the way fully automatic and subconscious. And a good example for this is driving. We might go very aware of like, oh my gosh, okay, left turn hand signal, we're going left, and you're doing all the motions in your mind, or even being in a new and unfamiliar place, all the way to doing it literally, while you're multitasking and doing other things. Oops. A good example of that can be demonstrated here. So right here, he's in this low stage right here. We're talking about lots of errors, clumsy, inefficient, right? He doesn't know how to do it. of practice. So clearly time is what is the X factor down here, or on this axis. Oh, he's getting a little bit better. Here's why I love this, because this is a foreshadow to the next part. He's training. He's not working on skill here. He's actually conditioning, which is the exercise portion that we'll talk about. Back to the practice. Oh, now he's up here in this associative stage. He's having fewer and smaller errors. He can detect and correct errors. There you go. Oh, got it. He's like, oh, gotta pick my leg up more. And really, that's essentially all I really need to show you. But practice is over time, and it occurs in stages according to this popular theory about learning, and it involves the topic of study neuroplasticity, which you'll learn more about. But yeah, practice is one of those things that we're all familiar with, and whether you knew it or not, your coach or your sport instructor or even your PE teacher was designing those practice activities to enhance your precision and skill about sport. So when it comes to training exercises, they are specific, planned, structured, and repetitive movements to maximize performance capacity. So when we talk about that, we're working in the world of conditioning. So if you've ever heard of a strength and conditioning coach, it's not the exact best title for it because conditioning involves strengthening also, but whatever. Conditioning means that you're working on someone's strength and their aerobic capacity, which is their stamina and also their recovery. So after they're working out, they're bouncing back maximally to work out harder the next day. And this is more of a conditioning aspect, strength and conditioning. It involves, again, enhancing those performance capacities. Now, when we're talking about strength factors, we're looking at strength, power, speed, stamina, and recovery, meaning the ability to, and here I've just kind of differentiated these terms because that's partially what this is about, but just to differentiate like strength, what's the difference between strength and power? Power just involves that there's a time element. There's like an explosive aspect, whereas strength, I mean, you can be pushing against a wall for as long as it takes to move the wall, and the measure of power is how quickly you could push over the wall, but which is not related to speed, because even though speed is a unit of anaerobic fitness, which I'm going to kind of differentiate more in a minute, it's an anaerobic fitness aspect like strength, but it doesn't necessarily involve force. It's just your ability to move through a cycle quick, which is definitely not which is definitely not aerobic. So I put it here with this category. We're going to look a little bit more at stamina in terms of the metabolism and energy resources, and recovery. And recovery will kind of bleed us right into our section on nutrition. So when we're talking about strength training or anaerobic fitness training, we're looking at enhancing muscle protein synthesis. And we already talked about this a little bit, and we looked at how resistance training creates little tiny amounts of micro stress. And actually a student brought up a really good question about, he heard that the whole micro tears thing is kind of a myth. And you know, if we're looking at it on the world of, I think tears is just a way to make it make sense to students on a logical level, but on a molecular level, it's the stress. It does create stress to the muscle. It creates enough stress that it triggers the muscle protein synthesis reaction, but it occurs through gene expression, right? So our genes express more of those muscle proteins so that if exposed to that stress again next time, that it is able to handle that load. And so again, when we lift weights and we create those, I won't say muscle fiber injuries because that's true, that isn't exactly accurate, but it's the stress to the muscle fiber that initiates this growth factor and initiates this response, muscle protein synthesis. Now, for the reason that we get stronger and that we can generate more force and that we can generate more force quickly is because we experience hypertrophy. And we've also touched on this before, but the muscle fibers, especially when they're the fibrillar ones, so we're actually talking about muscle proteins, fibrillar proteins, not just the fluid inside the muscle fiber, but real muscle proteins. When there's more of those, they're denser, they contract harder and with more force. And depending on the type of muscle, whether it's like a parallel or a pennant muscle, like the hamstring and the quad, we also increase with this resistance training or strength training exercise our cross-sectional area of the muscle. Again, generating more power when the muscle contracts. So we've got more and greater number of muscle fibers and the proteins in those muscle fibers, and we also have a greater cross-sectional area. The reason that we generate more power and speed is because our neural drive comes faster with conditioning. When we do strength and anabolic training, we develop a faster neural drive, which is the signal between our brain and our muscle. Now, we are talking here about the adaptations in the muscle that we are working on training when we are trying to get more strong and powerful in our sport. But we also have things that happen locally in the muscle when we're training and working on our anabolic condition for sports performance that will also help us perform. For instance, at the onset of exercise, we use 2 stored phosphagen systems. One of them is just regular stored ATP. And we don't have a lot of stored ATP in the muscle, and you can see that it depletes relatively quickly after the onset of exercise, within seconds. Creatine phosphate is another stored phosphinogen, and we've all heard of creatine phosphate. It's right here. And just like how we talked about ATP, adenosine, phosphate 1, phosphate 2, phosphate 3, that phosphate breaks off and that releases energy. Well, just like that happens with ATP, that also happens with a compound called creatine phosphate. So the creatine's here and the phosphate's hooked up here. That system only lasts a few seconds into exercise. However, when you rest between a set, this system, both of these phosphinogen systems, the stored phosphagen systems, they recycle and they replenish. So if you are healthy in your anaerobic replenishment systems, you're quickly between sets fixing and recycling ATP and creatine phosphate, rephosphorylating that high energy compound so that you can use them again just as powerfully and effectively on the very next set. So the more trained you are, the more anaerobically fit you are to perform, the better you recycle your stored phosphinogens. And we all know, this is a side note, I hope I don't get too distracted because this is what happens in recordings. And I know you can cut it out, but I'm too lazy for that. All that editing stuff. I don't know. I think they're a little better with Ratchet anyway. But okay. See, I'm already doing it. The second I see a supplement label, I start doing it. Okay. So creatine. We take this creatine, but the problem with creatine, and I'm not saying creatine is a problem, creatine has some great placebo effects. Some people even say it does improve power. It definitely increases sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So it definitely does pull some water into the muscle fiber, making it appear bigger, which definitely also has its benefits. But creatine, you might put more creatine in the muscle, but that doesn't mean that you have the enzymes and all of the conditioning to rephosphorylate that creatine. That's what comes with training, is the rephosphorylating these phosphinogens, rephosphorylating the adenosine diphosphate, rephosphorylating the creatine. So you can take all the creatine you want, it'll pull some water in your muscle, but it's probably not going to give you the type of power that you hope for. But again, don't shoot the messenger. It does look bigger. You do look bigger. Just like nitric oxide and other compounds that are kind of muscle, they make them bigger. And I'll explain that later. So glycolytic capacity, that's another thing that we do better when we are anaerobically trained for a sport. And when we are better at our glycolytic capacity, we're better at clearing lactate. And what that means is that when we're using in the muscle, we're using stored like local glycogen. We are breaking it down. We're getting that glucose free. And when there's no oxygen available, that turns all the way into lactic acid. And if you've ever felt the burn in a muscle, if you've ever worked out in your life such that you have felt your muscle burn, that is from the lactic acid. And it isn't actually the lactic acid, it's just the acid that is related to lactic acid production. I know I'm going into too much detail here, but whatever. So lactic acid is produced, and the acid portion, the OH negative portion, actually like dips off into the blood. Lactate's a great muscle fuel. Once it gets rid of the acid, it comes back in the muscle, and it can be even used for energy or to transport more lactic acid out of the muscle. So lactic acid has a bad rap. Lactate has a bad rap, but the acid portion, it builds up and it burns right in that localized muscle area. So people who are trained anaerobically have a higher glycolytic capacity. They can tolerate more lactate and they can clear more lactic acid. Let's see. And that happens, not in the red myoglobin rich oxidative environment, but that happens in the white twitch fibers, the glycolytic fibers, the ones that don't have much stored oxygen. So they need to figure out a way to get rid of that lactic acid. Now, we also have stamina factors that are related to training. So we train for our strength, we train for stamina. And stamina can be in the short term, again, like a arm wrestling competition, or it can be in the world of endurance. And when we're doing a long conditioning training, like for endurance events, we're going to see some pretty more measurable adaptations. So number one, oxygen delivery. And this happens by so many mechanisms. I'm just giving you some examples. So for one, your blood vessels, your endothelial lining makes more nitric oxide. More nitric oxide allows your blood vessels to vasodilate nicely. And of course, in the muscle, that's going to direct more blood flow there. And what is that blood carrying? It's carrying that oxygen. At the exact same time, when we train for our aerobic systems, we also develop more blood vessels. So you can see in this little animation how it's very, very small. It's kind of hard to see. See them growing? They grow just the most tiniest little bit. There we go. So that also helps deliver more oxygen more effectively to every single muscle fiber. Also, we have a greater oxidative capacity when we train. When we do it every day, when we're an athlete, when we work out, and you don't really know it necessarily, but you have a much better oxidative capacity, meaning that you can use fat better and you can use glucose better with oxygen. And so here's a rendition or a little schematic of us using oxygen. We can break down fats better. This is a long chain fatty acids to release lots of ATP recycling. We also break down glucose to release lots of ATP recycling. But the only reason I included glycolysis, because it's a little overly detailed, because you do get better. You have more enzymes to run through cycles of glycolysis. It's a pathway. You're like, glycolysis. You're better at it with training, but it's not even that significant in some ways because it only yields 32 ATP to run a whole glucose through its whole entire cycle of breaking it down to, again, release energy to recycle ATP. Where if you look at fat, one fatty acid, and you can get more depending on the length of the fatty acid, when we cleave it down to its little bits and parts and run it through aerobic metabolism, you get 460 ATP recycled. So when we say oxidative capacity improves, we're really talking about your ability to use fat. Now, why is this happening in the red fibers? Unlike back here where I was talking about, where I was talking about the white fibers, the glycolytic ones, the ones that don't have a lot of oxygen. These ones do have a lot of oxygen because they're red, right? Blood is red. These ones are filled with myoglobin, a protein that is just like hemoglobin in our blood, and it stores oxygen. So in these slow twitch fibers, which are the ones, by the way, that we use 99% of our life, but when you're training and you're training aerobically, like doing cardio work, lots and lots and lots of it, you're enhancing these particular type of red fibers. You're enhancing the amount of myoglobin you have in them. You're enhancing the enzymes and the ways that you can run this pathway, and you're also even enhancing glucose. Okay. Okay, see, I'm definitely digressing. You guys, I don't need you to know all this for the test. Like I always say, I am teaching you things that are helpful about the field of sport. And when you go into classes and you learn about how people get more aerobically fit, you're going to understand the cell level changes, which is so much easier to work from that than working backwards from big applied changes, at least in my opinion, because I would rather understand things from the ground up than from the top down. But anywho, we also, when we train aerobically, enhance gluconeogenesis, which is the ability to take other nutrient compounds like fat and amino acid and turn them into either energy through the TCA cycle or back to glucose, which sometimes we need that to shoot it back out into the blood to get it to the brain, because the brain is the only thing that's going to use, or the glucose is the only thing the brain is going to use. So if you're on a long exercise or endurance event, big hike, a big run, a big swim, a big cycle, your brain is eventually going to need glucose, and you're using gluconeogenesis to take other things, turn them into glucose, and send them out to the brain, or to be used in the muscle, depending on the situation. Let's see. So we also have an enhanced glycogenesis if we are aerobically trained, which means that we are able to make more glycogen after exercise. And this is the whole recovery part, right? So here we're talking about our ability to have stamina during exercise. We can keep going because our brain is fine. Our muscles have plenty of fuel. And then here we're talking about the oxygen delivery part. Well, here we're talking about after, or the recovery. So when you're anaerobically trained after exercise, you build more glycogen. You have more glycogenesis happening. You also have mitochondrial biogenesis, which is another just fancy type of protein synthesis, but because mitochondrial are protein type compounds, but more mitochondria are in the cells, which does what? It enables this. There's the mitochondria in the background. It enables more of that fat utilization. So let's talk about nutrition. And just like exercise, physical activity, same thing to start in terms of the image. We're talking about needs, which are a little special for sport, and the functions that those extra nutrients have. So for sports nutrition, we're talking about performance enhancement diets, and those follow these 3 paradigms: training diets, performance aids, and timing. So there is no perfect diet. I have to start by saying that, because this would be silly to tell you what is the perfect way to enhance your fitness or your performance condition by food or nutrients, because all kinds of athletes follow different types of macronutrient composition, different types of supplemental protocols, different types of eating and timing for their events. There is no one way. But in terms of lab-based research and what we collect and, what we do in a controlled environment, there are some things that we know hinder and promote performance when it comes to specifically to the recovery and the stamina aspects of performance. So that muscle contraction, this is a little thing of actin and myosin hooking together, those protein fibers, those muscle filaments, they are connecting, pulling together, and that does take extra energy. This takes energy and ATP to do. Every single time that hooks and connects, ATP is used and recycled. So that's costing us an extra 500 to 1,000 calories per day. Now, what you're looking at here is called the AMDR. And I introduced to you earlier that there is the dietary reference intake, and it's this big research report that tells us our nutrients that we need per day. And this is what that report suggests that our nutrients represent across our whole calorie allotment. So in other words, if I need 2,000 calories a day, we're looking at about 60% carbs, 55 to 70% carbs, 25 to 30% fat, or 10 to 35% protein. That's what they're suggesting. And I could talk forever about why this is like this and why this range is so big and do we need that many carbohydrates, but I'm not going to. And I'm going to say that for athletes and anyone training the training diet, there aren't any changes to this proportion. All that we're doing is taking that additional 500 to 1,000 calories and keeping the same proportion. Let's say I shot for 60 here, 15 here, and 25 here. We're keeping that same proportion. And if I did this by a 2,000 calorie diet, we're looking at about 75, 8, and 30 extra grams of each of these nutrients. That's not a lot. And if you've ever wondered why a protein supplement, whether it's from milk, pea, or soybean, why it's about 20 to 30 grams for your typical shake size serving, is because it's meeting this additional protein need. That also can be met though with like a simple can of tuna, or a simple serving of chicken breast, or a simple even serving of red meat, but limited, in the zone of 15 to 25 grams per serving per day. So let's talk a little bit more about protein in the training diet for the regular athlete. So there's a lot of misconceptions about the amount of protein that we need. And I'm not here to tell you how much protein you need, because it does vary based on a lot of different factors. However, this is the RDA, which again, I've told you about the DRI, which is that big report that tells us how much nutrients we should have in a day. And it's based on an assortment of research. I'm not saying the research is the most highest quality or the craziest in terms of its equity and representation whatsoever. I'm not even saying that it suits the needs of like pregnant and like. So we're looking here at, let's talk a little bit more about protein intake for the athlete following a typical training regimen and training diet. So there's a lot of misconception about how much protein an athlete needs. We're looking here at the dietary reference intake. And the dietary reference intake, again, like we talked about in health, tells us about how much of each nutrient we should aim to get each day. And this is based on research on healthy people, healthy situations, both in the lab and in longitudinal, like regular living settings. So you can see here in the far right column, that we have documented in research, again, about how much protein that the average, let's say a male in each age group, should get per day. Now, this is the RDA, the more popular one, and the one that our food labels are based off of. But if you're in the science world, you're following the EARs, which in the dietary reference intake, they're based on kilogram of body weight. So they're not generalized. Like, these are generalized to meet the needs of almost everyone in the population. Like, every guy from 19 to 70 needs 56 grams of protein per day. Clearly, that's a little like population specific, but it does make things easier. The DRI also includes, again, these values, which are more important if you're prescribing nutrients, but this is the amount of protein that you should get per kilogram of body weight per day. So in that same scenario, males 19 to 70 should get about 0.66 grams of protein. So let me reiterate that, less than 1 gram of protein per kilogram of their body weight, which I know you probably don't know what a kilogram is, but it's pounds divided by 2.2 per day. Okay, so remember this value, 0.66. Now, this value is estimated or rounded up a little bit. If you ever look this up, you might see the value of 0.81, but this is the DRI or the EAR, like the best, most research-driven value, and again, not rounded up for the population, but specific, is 0.66 grams per day. Now, this is a study looking at different types of athletes, both sedentary people, not different types of athletes, sedentary people, bodybuilding athletes, and endurance athletes, looking at a high protein diet. Now, all of them had more calories because obviously, again, they're training and they had to take in more calories, but even keeping the same proportion of protein, consuming 1.9 grams per kilograms per day, 2.7 and 2.7. And remember, what I just said we needed to be healthy as a human being was 0.66. So this is 1.9 grams per kilogram body weight, 2.7 grams. And again, these are the intakes of this is what people in this world are consuming and fed in research studies. And we're seeing what a positive nitrogen balance they're in. The next thing we're looking at down here is the balance. Positive nitrogen balance means that you are excreting nitrogen in your urine. Ideally, a person is in a balanced state with their nitrogen, meaning that they're consuming the amount that they're excreting. When you're up not excreting, when they're consuming the amount that their body needs, when they're excreting this much every single day, they're in a positive nitrogen balance. Athletes are building. They should be using lots of nitrogen, but they also shouldn't be processing lots of surplus nitrogen. So the point here is that there are misconceptions about how much we need a day. This is the actual research-based amount. This is the amount they're eating and being fed, and they're in a very state of positive nitrogen balance. So you can see that you don't have to go crazy when you're training on protein. So another paradigm with sports nutrition is performance aids. And these can range from anything just like regular nutrients, like we take vitamin and mineral supplements or protein concentrates or single amino acids, all the way to pharmacologic compounds. Things like caffeine, creatine, hormone precursors, pyruvate. I mean, some of them are nutritive in some ways, like, carnitine. We consume this naturally in food too, but it's just not technically one of those nutrients that are considered an essential nutrient. So those are considered in the pharmacologic performance category. The ones that you see highlighted, just to give you an idea of how complicated this world looks, but how simple it is all of these that I've highlighted right here are related to just this same figure we've already looked at, muscle protein synthesis. So when we do resistance training, our muscle cells are stimulated to make more actin and myosin, again, to tolerate that stress for next time. And involved in that process are all of these things. So we need HGH, or in the case of resistance training, in the case of growing, it's HGH, but in the case of resistance training, it's IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor 1. And if you take these individual amino acid supplements, it's supposed to enhance your production of HGH, which directly initiates or triggers muscle protein synthesis. Just like that, chromium and vanadium, they're supposed to enhance this receptor's sensitivity to insulin. So that post-exercise, whether there's carbs available and insulin secretion is high or not, the chromium and vanadium are supposed to make this receptor more sensitive, like a magnet to the insulin. Again, research on this is mixed, but these are the reasons that people take performance enhancing supplements, and including just plain old amino acids and minerals. Also, you see things like HMB, which is hydroxymethylbutyrate, which is a compound that people take because it is the precursor to the amino acid leucine. And leucine is a key amino acid, the only amino acid that stimulates mTOR, or the process of muscle protein synthesis. So lots of different supplements and things people take, and DHEA, which is another supplement people take to boost testosterone production. And testosterone directly also influences muscle protein synthesis, just like human growth hormone and just like leucine and the mTOR pathway. So again, just giving you a basis, just these pharmacologic compounds right here, branched chain amino acid, that's leucine, one branched chain amino acid is leucine. So lots of supplements just involved in this one particular process. And there are many other processes that contribute to our fitness. When it comes to the paradigm of exercise timing, we're in the world of pre and peri timing, which is pre-exercise, mid-exercise, and of course post, which is on the next slide, but post-exercise. So anytime you're exercising, we should be focused on getting a little bit of nutrients within 1 to 2 hours. And that can be 300 to 400 calories, depending on your tolerance and your digestive speed and efficiency. And that meal composition should be a little bit high in carbohydrates. So remember, we said that AMDR was anywhere from 55 to 70. So I'm at the high end of that range, saying that meal specifically should be about 70% carbohydrate, but it should be low glycemic. And you're probably like, wait, what? I thought glycemia was related to carbohydrate intake. And it is, but some carbohydrates aren't as high glycemic as others, and you can eat them with things that are low glycemic to slow down that absorption rate. So the carbohydrates we have before exercise should be low glycemic because you don't want them to secrete too much insulin at the onset of exercise, or else you're going to have rebound hypoglycemia. You won't be able to manage your blood sugar as well if you just had a surge of insulin right before you ate. So even though it should be high carb to get all of your carb ready, it shouldn't be high glycemic. And again, I know that feels counterintuitive, but things like 2 slices of whole wheat toast, that fiber slows down that glycemic effect or that blood sugar response. And you're still getting the carbs from the bread, but the fiber is slowing down its absorption and speed. That meal should also be low in fat because fat slows gastric emptying, and really is the reason we shouldn't eat before we exercise. The adage that we shouldn't is because of fats slowing the heck out of our digestive system. It slows them down. And again, when we start contracting our extremity muscles, we constrict those blood vessels in the gut area, and so it's not great to eat right before exercise, and a high fat meal especially. We're talking 60 to 120 minutes before. Peri or mid exercise, and this is only for long duration events lasting more than 90 minutes. We should surplus or add some kind of fluid every 30 minutes, about 1 cup of water with some kind of sweetener that is low glycemic. And I could talk forever and a day about the sweeteners that are used in sports drink, but essentially the reason they are popular is because they are not long sugar polydextrins. They are not single units which are absorbed too fast. They're made of little teeny 2 and 3 unit specialized lab formulated carbohydrate chains that are lightly sweet and pretty fast digested, but not too fast. So they're lower glycemic. So sports drinks really are specialized in their glycemic effect by the nature of the way that they bring those glucose molecules together. Let's see. And hopefully I'm making sense and you're not like, oh my God, it's so much information. I think we're almost done. So we're talking about the paradigm in sports nutrition of exercise timing. There's the whole world of the training diet. So we're talking about the paradigm of exercise timing in the field of sports nutrition, pre and peri or mid, and also post-exercise. So post-exercise, we're looking at, and specifically for weight training, and this is still the case also for endurance or long duration training, but definitely specifically importantly for weight training, within 1 to 3 hours, there has to be some kind of energies consumed, and there has to be some kind of a nice distribution between the carb and protein. And in this case, we love that high glycemic carbohydrate to initiate that boost in insulin. And if I have to take you back, which I've said it a few times, but that's okay. Insulin is one of the key hormones that are trickling. I need to slow down. triggering the anabolic response here, muscle protein synthesis. Insulin is needed, and we know that carbohydrates are the biggest pusher of the release of insulin. So back to that, having a little bit of a high glycemic push right after exercise helps us facilitate the uptake of both those amino acids and the glucose so that we create a bigger response. And this figure shows perfectly how the effect of protein ingestion is like this little can here, how there's always going to be, after exercise, a boost in muscle protein synthesis because, again, it releases that IGF. It makes the genes express more of that particular protein. But boom, it jumps huge when we feed, and particularly with protein. So protein's great to have, but also carbohydrates because of that insulin response. So with that, if we were in a live setting, I would ask you which of these is a better post-exercise choice, because both of them are very, very carbohydrate rich. In fact, the Greek yogurt, double strain, a lot of water gone, very high on protein as a relative percentage, 25 grams of protein per cup. And over here we have a chocolate banana smoothie, a little bit less protein, but 5 times the amount of carbs, 6 times the amount of carbs. So if you were paying any attention to all of that in the last 5 minutes, you would have touched this one, which is the one with the carbs and the protein. So, I didn't say this, but this study looked at protein ingestion, and this was only 10 grams of protein. So as little as 10 grams of protein after exercise within 3 hours post-exercise creates a giant jump, 10 grams. So 20, it's, the 25 gram difference isn't that big in terms of being a targeted specific post-exercise ingestion strategy. Oh my gosh, you guys are probably so happy that's done, but this is why I don't like recordings as much, but such is life and such is online learning. So thank you for listening, and remember, there's that slow feature where you can slow it down. All right, take care, guys.